The key to understanding Marc Chagall's amazing paintings lies in his childhood. You'll be surprised how simple and obvious their meaning becomes after I tell you the true story of his life, which you'll hardly find in Russian sources, and soon you'll understand why. Let's go. Marc Chagall, originally named Moshe Chagall, was born on July 6, 1887 into a Jewish family in Lyosno, a town near Vitebsk, which is now part of Belarus. At that time, it was a relatively new acquisition of the Russian Empire, gained after the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth a full century before the artist's birth. Along with this vast Russian territory came extensive Jewish settlements, which had not existed in Russia previously. And in order to prevent competition with Russian merchants and artisans, Jews were mandated to reside in ghettos, which were known as the Pale of Settlement. It was absolutely forbidden for Jews to travel beyond these settlements, and even more strictly prohibited to enter the capitals and provincial administrative centers. For this, a special permit or visa was required. An exception was made, but only for certain professions: first guild merchants, individuals with higher education, and those who had served in the military. Jewish children were forbidden from attending public schools, and a quota of no more than 10% was imposed on Jewish university admissions even within their own settlements. In capital cities, it was only 3%, specifically to prevent Jews from entering state service. In other words, Jewish families in 19th century Russia found themselves living in almost complete isolation under conditions of severe discrimination, their rights severely curtailed, which inevitably led to immense overpopulation within their settlements and widespread poverty. Marc Chagall was born into a relatively modest family and was the eldest of 9 children. His father worked as a loader for a herring merchant, hauling barrels of herring, earning 20 rubles a month, while the average across Russia was 13. His mother kept house, selling products from their home to the grocery store that was located right in their building. Vitebsk was quite a large city for those times. Its population was 66,000 people, half of whom were Jewish. Vitebsk was known as the Russian Toledo. It was a truly picturesque town adorned with churches, synagogues, public squares, and charming wooden houses, all of which sadly did not endure the devastation of the Second World War. And it was precisely his vivid childhood recollections of the vibrant Jewish community in Vitebsk, deeply imbued with impressions colored by profound nostalgia, that would ultimately become the fundamental cornerstone for the entirety of the artist's creative output. The Chagalls owned a small farm, a horse, a cow, chickens and goats. These animals would later become cherished figures in the artist's paintings. I will now read you a description of Vitebsk from the artist's autobiography, My Life, which I recently read. It will likely provide the most crucial key to understanding his work. This description conveys, through the artist's own eyes, what he saw, the environment he lived in, and the people he interacted with. I'll try to paint a picture in your mind of young Chagall's simple, charming life. Which is the main motif of his paintings. Pause. In the houses next to ours lived other families, each with their own concerns. Pause. Right behind us was the drayman's house. He worked as hard as his horse. The diligent beast tried its very best, pulling a heavy cart, but even more strained was the carter, lanky and gaunt, taller than the horse, longer than the cart itself. He earned very little. His wife illegally sold spirits, but her husband would secretly drink almost all the vodka by himself. And then there was no hope for any peace and quiet. He couldn't sing. Right opposite, there stood a small, dilapidated house. Tanya, a laundress and a petty thief lived there, and in the other half, a stove maker with his wife and a whole brood of children. From dawn till dusk, loud quarrels could always be heard from inside. Sometimes, after yelling her fill at her husband, the wife would come out to sit on the bench and get some fresh air. If I also happened to step out at that time, she'd shake her head, as if to say, "See what a rotten scoundrel he is?" Listen to him, and he's right. To the left, as in a small, also wooden house, lived 2, or rather 1.5 people. One was a dwarf. They traded horses and also stole pigeons, luring them from other people's dovecotes and snatching them mid-flight. On the street, they often harassed passers-by. Once it even seemed to me I was very young that one of them wanted to take me with him. Next to the stove maker lived the baker's family, the most respected on our street. From 5 in the morning, their windows were lit and smoke rose from the chimney. The kitchen oven blazed fiercely. In an hour or 2, whole baskets of excellent freshly baked buns were ready. I'd run there early in the morning and live happy with a pair of hot rolls. As you can see, in his book of memoirs and likewise in his other writings, he paints a pastoral picture of the picturesque, peaceful life of ordinary people within the Jewish community, as he himself was one of them. Chagall's parents were profoundly devout individuals, and thus the artist's entire formative years were imbued with the adherence to Kabbalah, its rituals, and time-honored traditions, which desperately sought to survive within a hostile surrounding, and whose very core and focal point was Vitebsk. Chagall admitted that through his paintings he wanted to preserve this vanishing culture so very dear to him, one of its most crucial aspects being, of course, Jewish music. No event, whether a wedding, a birthday, Purim or Hanukkah, could ever do without klezmers, those wandering musicians whose leader was always the violinist. The violinist always headed the wedding procession. Yeah, his music was meant to be expressive, to convey emotion, first deeply sorrowful, so the bride could truly mourn her departing youth, and then unrestrainedly joyful for the dancing. Musicians were practically the only source of entertainment for the townspeople, and soon the violinist and his violin, even when held by animals, would become perhaps the most frequent subjects in Chagall's paintings, symbolizing a spiritual detachment from mundane daily life, an elevation of the creative spirit above the city's ordinary existence. But enough digressions. I hope I've succeeded in painting for you a mental picture of that very Vitebsk, the one Chagall remembered and depicted with his matchless colors. Chagall was a scrawny, awkward child, quite unlike his father, which rendered him practically unfit for any kind of physical work. This simultaneously served as a justification for the future artist's decision, a crucial step he would take a little later. Up until the age of 13, he was educated at the local Jewish religious school, because as I previously stated, Jewish children were prohibited from attending regular schools. But when he turned 13, his mother finally managed to get her son into a regular school by bribing the principal with 50 rubles. 3 months of the family's income, mind you. However, this advancement didn't make Marc happy at all. Suddenly, he developed a speech impediment, a stutter which began to manifest during panic whenever he was called to the blackboard, and which would remain with him for his entire life. This is also vital for an artist. Remember it. In the end, Chagall excelled in subjects where speaking wasn't required, like geometry and drawing. He was completely useless in others, consistently receiving failing grades. Then one day, Marc saw his classmate bring some truly amazing drawings to school. Chagall was incredibly intrigued by them. These weren't just simple objects from art class, they were entire stories, complete with plots. Chagall, no, until this very moment, Atro and Zaido hadn't even known the word artist. Well, they had no artist, and village conversations about such matters never even came up. When Marc asked how he did it, his classmate explained he took books from the library and copied illustrations from them. Chagall was truly astonished by this new concept, to transfer what one sees onto paper, to tell stories through images without needing to resort to hesitant speech, to craft a narrative with one's hands rather than with one's voice. And he copies his classmate, and takes books from the library, begins enthusiastically tracing illustrations, and soon people start calling him an artist. But not yet because he was good, but because he simply couldn't help but draw. By the age of 18, Chagall decided that painting was precisely what he wished to pursue for the rest of his life. He then stumbled upon a new school in the city, run by the realist artist Yehuda Penn, and went to his mother to shock her with the sudden announcement that he wanted to become an artist. An artist! To his mother and his whole circle, dealing in herring and cattle, this announcement sounded almost as if he decided to become a stamp collector, an entirely impractical, incomprehensible pursuit, obviously leading down an utterly unavoidable path to poverty. And Chagall's bewildered mother took his drawings and went to Penn, hoping he would simply reject her son, and the whole matter would be resolved. However, Penn, upon seeing Marc's sketches, decided there was a spark of talent in them, and agreed to take him on as a student even without charge in exchange for work at the studio, which was, in fact, a very common arrangement. So Chagall, much to the disappointment of his mother and the entire family, became an artist's apprentice, though this did not last for very long. As you can already see, realism and academicism were certainly not his style. His mother and sisters simply couldn't comprehend this ridiculous choice, but they truly appreciated the canvases of Chagall's paintings. They were quite sturdy and perfectly suitable for use as floor mats, as Marc often discovered them upon his return home. Chagall speaks very warmly of his mother and his entire family. In this adult recollection rather entertained him, emphasizing just how ridiculous his occupation appeared to those around him. And at their Penn school, Chagall has a fateful encounter. I think you've already noticed from my videos that great artists very often break free from poverty by meeting someone who can lift them from the very bottom and show their talent to the world. Chagall makes the acquaintance of Penn's young student, Victor Meckler, who happened to be the son of an exceptionally wealthy merchant. These two individuals hailed from two entirely distinct social strata, the kind that would, in the normal course of life, never typically cross paths. However, Chagall possessed significantly greater talent, and Meckler specifically requested his assistance with drawing, even going so far as to offer him payment. However, Marc proposed a significant deal to him, a bond of friendship in exchange for his assistance, and that's how these two completely different individuals became close friends. Chagall gained entry into affluent society, frequently visiting the opulent home of the Meckler family, and for the very first time engaging in profound discussions about art and culture. A year later, both young men decided it was time to move on. Meckler planned to go to St. Petersburg to continue his studies, but Chagall had no money. Moreover, Meckler was from a first guild merchant family, so he had the right to leave the city. Chagall, however, didn't have that right, but Meckler offered his help with the relocation and initial funds. Chagall went to his father, pleading for permission to leave, and his father, quite reluctantly, agreed, angrily throwing 27 rubles right under the table. This was the absolute most he was prepared to offer his son, firmly stating he would not finance his son's wild, crazy ideas. However, he helped his son concoct a permit to leave the city by asking that very same herring merchant to register his journey as a business assignment. And 20-year-old Chagall left his native Vitebsk for the first time and traveled to the northern capital, a huge and bustling city he would never have dared to visit alone, but to live in which yet another permit was still required. And soon this desperate adventure will end in arrest. St. Petersburg 1967 appunto uscì a 1907, a place both heavenly and hellish. Along the electric-lit Nevsky, carriages of the wealthy are heading to the Mariinsky Theater. The first cinemas are opening their doors. In the art world, mysticism and cabaret are coming into vogue, and poets recite their verses in art cafes. However, the first Russian Revolution has just ended. It has been suppressed, and a period of reaction is rapidly gaining momentum. Stolypin's activities are in full swing, as are the military field courts, which indiscriminately hang everyone, placing on suspects the infamous Stolypin ties, nooses. The police were carrying out mass sweeps and raids on those who lived in the city illegally, while Jews in the northern capital were only permitted to stay for a maximum of 24 hours without special permission. Chagall submits his sketches to the School of the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, which Nicholas Roerich himself directed, and one of the four wins a scholarship program with a stipend of 10 rubles per month. This was a very small amount of money for the capital city, so he was forced to subsist on tea and bread, sharing a single bed with a craftsman in a tiny rented room. However, at school, he was once again taught academicism, made to draw plaster figures, and given the fundamentals of classical techniques. And from the very beginning, Chagall felt that his sterile conservative art was washing away the colors, the vibrant palette that formed his very essence as an artist. Simultaneously, the first signs of the avant-garde began to emerge in cultural life. Traditional academic painting began to seem to young artists, including Chagall and Meckler, lifeless and uninspiring. Pause. The ideas that had originated in distant Paris finally reached Russia with significant delay and began to take root. Lev Bakst and Alexandre Benoit were setting the tone in painting and theatrical stage design, and it was specifically to Bakst that Chagall dreamed of studying, considering him the ultimate authority. Chagall persistently sought out various wealthy patrons, hoping to secure the support of a rich benefactor who could provide financial assistance to the artist in his early career. It was a rather common occurrence, you see. Wealthy benefactors would often sponsor promising young artists and talents. It was widely considered a very prestigious and at times quite a profitable undertaking. Victor Meckler introduced him to his relative, who in turn presented Marc to Grigory Abramovich Goldberg, a well-known lawyer and prominent public figure, who was also Jewish. He decided to help Chagall and arrange a fictitious position for him, ostensibly as a footman in his own residence. This was allowed, but only under the terms of such legalization. The footman had to dine and live in the master's house, never leaving its confines. So one fine day, Chagall was caught by the police during another raid, returning from school, and was thrown into a lockup, where he spent 2 weeks with beggars and criminals. Goldberg had to use all his influence to free Chagall, and after this, the frightened artist decided to formalize his status and, again with Goldberg's help, found work at a sign workshop. At school, Chagall met the daughter of another well-known wealthy Jewish lawyer, Maxim Berson, Alia Berson. They became friends, and Chagall began helping her with painting. She could no longer live with Goldberg, though they remained on very warm terms, so Alia eventually arranged with her father for Chagall to stay with them as a poor relative. And so, the Satis lived in the rich man's house and went to school where his teachers weren't too pleased with his progress. He constantly experimented, but academism doesn't tolerate experiments. That's what academism is. All the rules of painting are prescribed and must be strictly observed. And naturally, this approach was quite distinct from Chagall's artistic manner and personal style. However, in St. Petersburg, there was yet another highly prestigious institution within the capital, Zvantseva's private art school, where none other than Lev Bakst, so greatly admired by Chagall, and Mstislav Dobujinsky were among the instructors. Chagall only sought admission to Bakst's class after experiencing failures at other institutions. He simply had no other viable options left at that point. He brought his Vitebsk works for the viewing. Bakst, also Jewish, already world famous and Diaghilev's lead artist for the Russian seasons, looked at the sketches and said the famous phrase, "Your works are very interesting, you have talent but you are very spoiled. You need to forget everything and start over." This school was regarded as Russia's most progressive, boasting the very latest Parisian influences. Yet its tuition fees were an unimaginable 30 rubles each month. Chagall and even his father never had that kind of money. And Maxim Berson, Alice's father, whose daughter had enrolled in this school, agreed to sponsor Chagall's education. This is how it often happens, friends. If you discriminate against a group, it only grows stronger. And so it was with Chagall's Jewish origin. On the one hand, it served as a stigma and an unfair limiter of any rights, but on the other, it created truly incredible connections that literally drew the young Jew into the high society of the northern capital. It was precisely at Bakst's school where he first encountered Nijinsky and Countess Tolstoy, and it was this very school that would pave Chagall's path to distant, progressive Paris, the undisputed capital of world art and the ultimate dream of every aspiring artist of that era. Bakst, a renowned master of theatrical design, greatly motivated Chagall, serving as an inspiring role model for Jewish success. Curating stage sets for theaters was considered a very prestigious job, and it was through Bakst that Chagall became acquainted with experimental theater, and this connection, many years later, would lead him to paint the Paris Opera Garnier. It was specifically at Bakst's school that a significant turning point occurred in Chagall's artistic development. Bakst often traveled to Paris, and from there he brought back all kinds of fresh and innovative ideas. He spoke at length about Matisse, who was at that very time making a huge name for himself in Paris, and about the Fauvists with their wild, distorted, and truly unbelievable colors. And it was precisely this vibrant color palette that yearned to burst forth from Chagall's very essence, constantly suppressed by the conservatism of academism. Somewhere there, far away, in Paris, exactly what Chagall himself longed to create and deeply felt was not only happening, but also gaining immense popularity. The dream of reaching Paris became an overwhelming obsession for the young artist. However, there were conflicts. Bakst, an aesthete, loved refinement, but Chagall showed his provincial, simple, even crude approach. Bakst constantly criticized Chagall for the incorrect anatomy in his paintings. Chagall, however, retorted that the truth of life was more important than incorrect proportions. As we already know, this is precisely what would make him one of Europe's most famous artists. In 1910, Bakst was once again heading to Paris, this time permanently, accompanying Diaghilev's ballets russes, and Chagall, who had already heard of the Impressionists and the artist who had cut off his own ear, begged them to take him along, even if it was just to paint the stage backdrops. Bakst agreed and even allotted him 100 rubles for his training as a scenery painter, but the results did not satisfy him and he refused, stating, "You have talent, but you don't know how to obey. In Paris, you will simply vanish or become a complete nobody." This deeply and painfully wounded Chagall. His dream was quite literally being snatched from right under his nose, and he once again returns to Vitebsk, where, as if to compensate for this profound loss, he paints everyone he encounters, avidly seeking out distinctive models, plucking strangers off the street and installing them squarely at the heart of his whimsical compositions. And soon he encountered the deafening inspiration for his entire life. He meets Bella Rosenfeld, the daughter of prosperous jewelers who possessed a remarkable 3 jewelry stores in Vitebsk. Chagall, with his romantic curls and rather ascetic face, Gerstede enjoyed considerable success with the ladies, but he was in fact quite awkward and very shy. He first met Bella's friend, who was absolutely crazy about him, but she just couldn't manage to get him to be intimate. However, upon meeting Bella, Chagall immediately understood that it was with this woman he wished to spend his entire life. His girlfriend was instantly forgotten, and Bella reciprocated his feelings much to the great displeasure of her wealthy parents, who viewed the penniless unknown artist from a stevedores family as an extremely undesirable match. But as with any Jewish woman, it proved utterly impossible to dissuade the deeply enamored Bella. Truth be told, the then unknown Chagall couldn't offer Bella anything at that time, so emboldened by love, Chagall returned to St. Petersburg, determined to become someone.
Meanwhile, in Petersburg, the Jewish mafia continued its effective work for their people. And among the capital's wealthy Jews, a rumor spread about a young and very talented Jewish artist from Vitebsk. And Chagall was introduced to a single individual who would profoundly change his destiny and make possible the Chagall we have come to know today. This was Maxim Vinaver, a Jewish man, a prominent deputy of the Stat Duma, the publisher of the journal Voskod, which was known for supporting national art, and a truly insightful and generous patron. They were introduced by their old friend from Vitebsk, Victor Mekler. Soon after, Chagall arrived at Vinaver's luxurious office, carrying rolls of his paintings without stretchers, as he simply didn't have the money for them. Unlike everyone else in St. Petersburg, who considered Chagall's style primitive, Vinaver was immediately captivated by the stories and the vibrant colors that Chagall's paintings conveyed. Vinaver considered it his life's mission to develop Jewish art and was actively searching for genuine talents who possessed the potential to ignite the star of Jewish painting. And it seems it was at this very moment that he finally found it. This wasn't simple patronage, it was a clear, pragmatic deal. Sponsorship in exchange for the artistic authority that any patron gained by unearthing a true gem in the rough, and also for the growing influence of Jewish culture. He even bought 2 paintings by Chagall, and this was the artist's very first sale for an unimaginable 800 rubles. But in Russia, Chagall's paintings held no interest for anyone. This entire Jewish folk art aesthetic, its animalism and the primitivism of Chagall's works was perceived by the art scene as outdated. Russian art in 1910 was on the very brink of an explosion. The Peredvizhniki movement, and with it realism itself, were gradually losing their influence, being increasingly seen as having become completely outdated. In their place, new artistic currents emerged, along with a fervent search for innovative forms, prominently led by Bakst and Benoit and their World of Art organization. The Jack of Diamonds exhibition is about to open, where Mikhail Larionov, Natalia Goncharova and Pyotr Konchalovska will challenge society, re-evaluating art in a new Lubbock form and vibrant Fauvist colors, creating a new proto-populism, a return to Russian roots in a new way. Kandinsky in 1910 would create his very first abstract painting, shifting art's focus from the objective realm to the non-objective, and thus beginning a significant movement towards Malevich's Black Square, a direction with which Chagall himself would very soon contend. In other words, the Russian art world was undergoing a swift and dramatic change, rejecting its old established artistic traditions, and it appeared drawing ever closer to Chagall's distinctive style. But Chagall, he was a storyteller. Every one of his paintings was a fantasy, and what's more, always on a Jewish theme. But the artists of the new movement, they rejected any kind of narrative. Now, to them, considering the rich legacy of traditional art, it appeared to be an overly simplistic approach to engage with the audience, far too direct. While agreeing with Chagall, or don't agree with Chagall and adopting his form, they rejected his content. Chagall sometimes went to art parties, joined discussions, but never enjoyed loud debates. He was always an individualist, believing one should learn from the originators of ideas, and they lived in distant, unattainable Paris. And at the end of 1910, the Vinaver, seeing Chagall's great torment, suggested to him, you know what, why don't you just go to Paris? The second toys. You'll suffocate here. I'll give you a small monthly stipend and you just go there, study and write. He gave him a scholarship of 125 francs, on which one could live very modestly, but still survive in Paris. And 23-year-old Chagall, for the first time in his life, under Vinaver's patronage, receives a passport and travels to Paris, where the legendary La Ruche awaits him. Upon his arrival in Paris, Chagall immediately visited an exhibition of independent artists and understood just how far Russia had fallen behind the cutting edge of artistic thought. During those years, the French art world was dominated by Cubism, which involved the analysis of real-world objects and their decomposition into constituent parts. The Cubists, at the height of their fame, led by Picasso and Braque, were arrogant, seeing themselves as pioneers of a new art form. They looked down on all other styles. Chagall's art, however, was almost the opposite of cold, analytical Cubism, prioritizing sentimentality, the artist's imagination, and the story told over new forms and manners of painting. Therefore, even here in Paris, his art was not understood. His Jewish and also his Russian motifs were perceived as archaic and culturally alien. He settled in the famous Hive. This building in Montparnasse was designed by Gustave Eiffel as a temporary pavilion for wine. In the 1910s, it transformed into a dormitory where immigrant artists could live for next to nothing. The small rooms in the Hive were tiny and shaped like a segment of a circle. In winter, it was unbearably cold, and in summer, it was stifling. Chagall resided in one of those tiny compartments, where his bed, easel and table were pressed closely together. The funds provided by Vinaver were barely sufficient for his rent and a small amount of food. When his canvases were all gone, he would paint upon his nightshirts, his bed sheets, and even the tablecloths that he had brought with him from his home. A great many of his masterpieces from his Parisian period were created upon the basis of simple, everyday household fabric. His neighbors included other future legendary artists like Amedeo Modigliani, Chaim Soutine, and Fernand Léger. But even among them, he was known as an eccentric because to avoid soiling his valuable garments, he always painted his pictures naked. In Paris, he encountered the original works of Impressionists and Fauvists with their vibrant colors, and his artistic palette began to transform. He then adopted certain elements of Cubism, starting to blend various objects and figures within his canvases, adding a distinct Cubist angularity to them. Yet the narrative quality of his paintings never truly disappeared. Cubist elements remain merely a form, complementing the narrative rather than being an end in themselves. Initially, it was very difficult for him. He didn't know the language, had no friends, and was, generally, not a very sociable stutterer. Can you imagine what it was like in 1910, coming from a remote village to Paris, trying to navigate this crazy soup of bubbling new ideas and talents? Right there, in the hive of Piros, Nokut Estide, Putin of another fateful meeting happened. A Russian revolutionary in exile came to him, who wrote about new art for Russian newspapers. He was curious to see the Russian eccentric who painted strange pictures naked. It was Anatoly Lunacharsky, and he was the very first person who absolutely adored Chagall's paintings for their whimsical and imaginative quality. Chagall enrolled in the La Palette Academy, an avant-garde art school, and also found employment at another academy. He spent his free time visiting art galleries and salons, especially the Louvre. Among the artists he particularly admired were Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Renoir, Pissarro, Matisse, Manet, Ardèze, and Delacroix. Chagall was absolutely delighted and often took long walks along the banks of the Seine. Ardèze, c'est pas possible. Everything in the French capital felt so new and utterly captivated him. The charming shops, the delightful scent of fresh bread each morning, bustling markets filled with vibrant fruits and vegetables, the grand wide boulevards and the inviting cafes and restaurants. And of course, towering above it all was the magnificent Eiffel Tower. But there was also one truly immense advantage here. Generally speaking, no one really cared whether he was Jewish or not. Here, he first felt like an equal, not a second-rate person, but his paintings still weren't selling, and the second person to praise him was the poet Apollinaire, the chief critic and voice of Paris's art scene at the time, mind you. By then, Chagall had developed a rich repertoire of whimsical motifs, spectral figures soaring through the sky, a colossal violinist dancing atop miniature dollhouses, domestic animals in unexpected hues and translucent wombs, and within them, tiny infants slumbering upside down. He embraced the vibrant colors of Fauvism, the sharp angles and gradients of Cubism, yet he remained uniquely himself. Most of his scenes from life in Vitebsk were painted while he was living in Paris. Their whimsical, sentimental undertone, a longing for his native places, struck Apollinaire, who then called them surrealistic, and this was the first time the word surrealism was applied to a painting. It is precisely for this reason that Chagall, among other things, is regarded as one of the forefathers of surrealism. Even though he led an eventful life in Paris and made significant creative progress, Chagall deeply longed for Russia and for Bella. And then a significant event takes place, one that will prove to be both tragic and absolutely pivotal in Chagall's life. Chagall exhibits at the Salon des Indépendants. This was the largest Parisian exhibition for avant-garde young unrecognized artists, and it was visited by the wealthy German gallerist Herwarth Walden. He was amazed by how much Chagall's paintings differed from everything else that was at the exhibition. In a time where artistic experiments with form held sway, Chagall presented entire stories, visions, and the naive, almost childlike fantasies of an artist, which perfectly aligned with the canvas of the then emerging Expressionism. A style where the artist's emotions truly came to the forefront. And Apollinaire who knew the gallery owner, it took little effort to literally sell Chagall to him, convincing the German that this mad Russian is the future of world art. And Walden decides to take a chance, offering the then unknown Chagall a solo exhibition in Berlin. A solo exhibition was not something every artist was granted. It was a tremendous honor and a true rarity. Of course, Chagall agrees, bringing to Berlin almost everything he had painted in 4 years in Paris, 40 canvases and 160 gouaches. His plan was simple. First, an exhibition in Berlin, then he would leave his paintings with the gallerist for a few weeks, and he himself would travel to Vitebsk to visit Bella. Now he would finally have something substantial to offer her parents. Before the solo exhibition, Walden also included Chagall's works in a massive group show in 1913. There hung works by Picasso, Braque, Kandinsky, and Delaunay. Against this backdrop, Chagall's strangeness didn't repel, but rather made him stand out. Walden observed that viewers and critics, even if they complained, simply couldn't ignore Marc's paintings. They consistently evoked a strong emotional reaction. So he wasn't surprised when Chagall's solo exhibition was a colossal success. However, Chagall didn't get to see it. Just days after the opening, he left for Russia, and literally a couple of weeks later, World War I began, closing all of Europe's borders and trapping Chagall in Russia for 8 years. Russia and Germany, who found themselves on opposing sides of the front and were at war, had practically seized all postal and any other form of communication. Therefore, by tragic irony, Chagall, while still in Russia, did not know about the colossal success that this exhibition had brought him. Let me jump ahead a little bit and say that Walden will lose Chagall, being absolutely certain that he had perished, and will begin to sell the artist's paintings, which will sell like hotcakes, while Chagall himself, he won't even suspect that his name is becoming iconic, while he himself will plunge into the abyss of creative stagnation and the feeling of being unneeded in the new Russia. Only towards the very end of the war, after the 1917 revolution, will rumors finally begin to reach him. Russian artists and critics who by some miracle return from Europe will tell him, "Mark, in Berlin, you are God. Young people imitate you. Your paintings hang in museums and articles are written about you as a leader of expressionism." I think Chagall would be listening to this with utter disbelief. For him, who was living through hunger, devastation, and political purges, these stories would seem like fairy tales from a past life. But first things first. Returning to Vitebsk, Chagall visited his parents and, of course, reunited with Bella. However, just a couple of weeks later, the First World War began. Martial law was officially declared throughout Russia. All men were strictly forbidden from leaving their villages, and the national border was completely sealed. The threat of army conscription hung over Chagall. This was the most terrifying thing that could possibly happen to any family, and all of Vitebsk was frantically searching for ways to protect their men. Chagall himself pondered this, and even went to visit the local rabbi to seek his counsel on how he might avoid military service. He and Bella deeply wished to marry, but her parents were vehemently opposed, and it took Chagall considerable effort to persuade them that he was a promising artist. And it was only a recent exhibition in Berlin, coupled with the advocacy of an influential figure from St. Petersburg, none other than Chagall's patron in Paris, Deputy Maxime Villeneuve, that finally swayed Bella's parents' firm resolve. The outbreak of war, bringing with it a wave of uncertainty, combined with Bella's unwavering persistence, ultimately sealed their fate. The wealthy Rosenfelds, though highly reluctant, finally conceded to this union, which they considered quite dubious. However, just 2 short years later, this very alliance would prove to be their genuine salvation. In 1915, they had a lavish wedding with Bella. In his book, Chagall describes feeling like an outsider at this opulent celebration hosted by his in-laws, among all those people dressed up and adorned with diamonds. But Bella was happy. She fully supported her husband, and from that moment until the very end of her life and his, she would become the artist's main muse, not only inspiring him but also approving all his paintings. However, the wedding did not save him from the threat of conscription, and then Bella's brother came to the rescue, as he held a good position in St. Petersburg. He got Chagall a clerk's job at the Military Strategic Office of the Central Military Industrial Committee in Petrograd. This was a very fortunate decision, as the position not only exempted him from conscription, but also allowed Chagall and his wife to move to Petrograd, receiving a state salary and saving them from the hunger already engulfing warring Russia. By day, he worked at a hated job, shuffling papers, and in the evening he returned home to Bella and their newborn daughter and painted his warm fantasies, working on the famous painting Over the Town, sketches for which he created almost immediately after their wedding. This canvas symbolizes everything most precious to the artist: the his beloved wife, and their Vitebsk, with the acknowledgement that its place in his heart is now given to another. He disliked Petrograd, this large and noisy city. Moreover, anti-Semitism hadn't gone anywhere after the 1905 revolution, and with martial law, patrols constantly roamed the city, searching for suspicious individuals without documents. Some were killed on the spot, their bodies thrown into the Neva. Chagall was once stopped too, while returning from duty. Who are you really? A kike? They questioned him directly, and Chagall realized he would surely be killed if he simply said yes. He fearfully showed his work ID and just lied, and they let him go. But he remembered this incident for a very long time as evidence of the utterly humiliating and absurd situation in Tsarist Russia for an artist who had just exhibited in Berlin, when a piece of paper protected him better than recognition. In 1915, Chagall began to exhibit his works in Moscow, initially at a well-known salon, and then in 1917 also in St. Petersburg. He once again displayed his pieces at the Moscow exhibition for avant-garde artists. This brought him a certain amount of recognition, and a number of affluent collectors began to acquire his artworks. But soon, a new calamity struck Russia. Not only was the country involved in the war, the February Revolution of 1917 broke out, which literally turned the nation's entire way of life upside down and brought many changes and far from always positive ones. And following February, the October Revolution erupted and the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, declaring the rule of the Soviets. And with the arrival of the new government, all restrictions and legal disabilities imposed on Jews were finally removed. Furthermore, Lunacharsky, an old acquaintance of Chagall from his time in Paris, returns from France and is appointed the first People's Commissar of Enlightenment, known as Narkompros. He immediately offers Chagall the position of head of the Fine Arts Department of Narkompros in Petrograd, essentially making him the country's chief art official.
If Chagall had accepted this position, it's possible his life and the destiny of all Russian art would have unfolded quite differently.
But he refused. He had just freed himself from tedious bureaucratic work, and he realized that this was absolutely not what he wanted to be doing. And then Lunacharsky offered him the position of Vitebsk's Commissar of Arts, tempting the artist with the unique opportunity to build a utopian city, where every single poor person could learn to paint.
Chagall, naturally, could not possibly turn down such an opportunity. On September 12, 1918, Chagall received an official certificate stating, "Ubo, Comrade Marc Chagall is appointed Commissioner for Arts of the Vitebsk Governorate." Surprisingly, Chagall's humble background under the new government became a distinct advantage for him. The authority of the workers and the peasants proved to be his own authority. He returns to Vitebsk as a significant figure and immediately sets about establishing an art school. He secures buildings and funding, acquires equipment and all necessary materials, hires his first teacher Yehuda Pen, and fully dedicates himself to the process of establishing the very educational institution whose vision had so captivated him. He wanted to create a truly free community of artists, where young talents are not told what or how they should create, and where each individual can discover their own unique path.
In other words, he wanted to provide his students with something he himself had never had, and he was remarkably successful in this endeavor. The school quickly filled with eager students and soon gained an excellent reputation. Students traveled from all corners of Russia and even from the major capitals to enroll there, and before long it became one of the most significant avant-garde centers in Russia during the 1920s.
The new government declared all things bourgeois to be its enemy. Everything associated with Tsarist Russia or with wealth was deemed hostile and marked for destruction. Power, especially in local areas, was seized by uneducated workers and peasants who were so far removed from aesthetics and art that the language of art was completely foreign to them. The recently impoverished freely enjoyed power, taking revenge on all who had been their superiors just yesterday. Brave young men drove through Vitebsk, dispossessing prosperous families. They even reached Chagall's wealthy in-laws. A gang of armed young men violently forced their way into Bela's parents' home. They held knives at the throats of the elderly couple and proceeded to remove everything valuable from the house, including all the silverware, and then proceeded to ransack all three of their jewelry shops. They were unable to open the safes, so they returned the next day in a truck, loaded the safes, and drove them away to be cut open, hoping to find treasures inside. They threatened to imprison the elderly parents themselves or even execute them. So the old couple had to seek protection from Chagall, whom they had only recently considered an unsuitable match for their daughter. He, of course, readily assisted them. However, in the art world, events were unfolding that were fundamentally shaking its very foundations.
2 years ago, in 1915, Malevich painted his Black Square as Kiruis Patoisinimde Tokisinoxer as a complete opposition to all that was natural, classical, and alive.
And from that moment, Betete, suprematism, autonomna, ultimate non-objectivity, began to oppose classicism and academism. After the revolution, even more broadly, all old art was declared bourgeois and hostile. This time is also called the dictatorship of the avant-garde. Suprematism, futurism, and constructivism were recognized as truly proletarian art. And Chagall, though technically belonging to the avant-garde, with his warm tones and serene narratives, once again didn't quite fit into the general revolutionary current. Even Lunacharsky once asked Chagall, Mark Zakharovich, why are your cows green and people flying? What does this have to do with Marx and Lenin? Chagall replied, the most direct connection, revolution, it's a flight and the renewal of nature. And that answer satisfied the minister. 2 years later, in 1919, Chagall invited Malevich to Vitebsk to teach at the People's Art School he had established. Chagall wanted to bring together the best masters from various movements, but Malevich didn't just come to teach, he came to preach suprematism as the only true religion of the new era, which clashed with the artistic pluralism Chagall was fostering.
Malevich was a charismatic and commanding leader. He was loud, blunt, and absolutely brilliant, the complete polar opposite of the timid, stuttering Chagall. He convinced students that Chagall's goats and violins were sentimental petty bourgeois kitsch, and that the future was non-objective, geometric, and collective. Swept up in reshaping the world, they flocked from Chagall's studio to Malevich's unovisme, Seira Presinavestastimum, the champions of the new art. In June 1920, while Chagall was in Moscow buying paints, Malevich staged a coup by organizing a vote that declared the school suprematist. Chagall's studio was abolished as unnecessary, and Chagall himself was ordered to leave the school he had created with such love within 24 hours. Chagall was deeply hurt, but he realized it was pointless to fight fanatics. My students, those whom I love so much, betrayed me. They defected to Malevich because he promised them a new system, while I offered them only labor and exploration, he wrote. So he resigned and left for Moscow. In Moscow, he was offered a job as a set designer at the recently established State Jewish Chamber Theater. Jewish connections once again. He was to begin work in early 1921 with a production of several plays by Sholem Aleichem. For the opening, he created several large backdrop murals featuring various lively scenes with dancers, violinists, acrobats, and of course animals. What would it be without them? One critic at the time called it Jewish jazz in colors. On the eve of the premiere, they brought him a pile of old clothes, and Chagall painted them by hand. He also started attending art gatherings. It was an era of poet cafes and fierce revolutionary bohemia, where Chagall felt like an outsider. Loud Mayakovsky was deafening, and Yesenin, though closer in spirit, was just a drunkard wasting his talent in scandals. Then Malevich returned from Bimemchi Vici Eredritameitida. The school had collapsed without Chagall, and he threatened to hang him from a lamppost. Alexander Rodchenko called for the complete destruction of art, proclaiming the death of painting, and David Sternberg, an artist and at the same time the head of the Fine Arts Department of the People's Commissariat for Education, told him, you know, Mark, my wife and I only paint chairs now. Paintings are no longer needed. They're an anachronism. Can you imagine the alien environment the quiet Chagall found himself in, with his animalistic fairy tales about Vitebsk? In Russian art of that time, many significant and interesting events were actually taking place. I'll definitely tell you about them sometime. Subscribe so you don't miss out. A kind of revolutionary blindness pushed these ideas toward a state of sterile absurdity. Often much like at the school, where students begged Chagall to return once they realized their mistake, many artists returned to tradition. In the end, even a figure like Malevich could sustain his suprematism for very long. Well, you really cannot just draw squares, rectangles, and stripes for all of eternity. Suprematism would soon cease to exist entirely, and Malevich himself would eventually turn to primitivism, though it was far more mediocre than any painting by Chagall. In short, things didn't work out between Mark Zakharovich and revolutionary art, nor between its representatives and Chagall. But the Bolsheviks weren't just ruining art, they were ruining the country. The country plunged into civil war, followed by famine. In 1921, a combination of severe drought and the consequences of the war communism policy of surplus appropriation, which stripped peasants of grain reserves and incentives to sow, led to food shortages that gripped 35 provinces, resulting in 5 million deaths from starvation. The country ignored to art. Painting for a living grew hard. Chagall and his wife moved to Malakovka, near Moscow. It was a 2-hour trip, but cheaper. The three of them, his wife, and their daughter, shared a single bed in an attic under the roof, where they barely fit. I'll give you another excerpt from his book, so you can hear firsthand the horror the artist lived in. We found some sawhorses, put them against the bed, and widened it a bit. The house retained the smell of its former owners, the heavy scent of illness. Apothecary bottles were scattered everywhere, and dry dog waste could be found. The windows stood wide open summer and winter. Downstairs in the communal kitchen, a cheerful village woman bustled about putting bread in the oven and laughing heartily as she naively recounted her adventures. During the famine, I carried sacks of flour on freight trains, somehow getting them from distant villages. And then one day, I ran into a police patrol, about 25 men, and I was alone in the car. They said, transporting flour is forbidden. There's a decree. Don't you know? Well, I just lay down. All 25 of them took their turn. I could barely even stand, but my flower was saved. I find myself just staring at her mouth. But at night she would go down to the basement where the foresters lived. Oh, if only they didn't take it into their heads to burst in on us with axes. During all those final, gloomy, hungry years in Moscow, he didn't paint, trying to find any way to earn money because they were living hand to mouth. He worked on stage designs, making sets and small illustration jobs, trying to feed his family. So when he was offered a job teaching drawing at a children's colony in Malakovka, he accepted. Imagine if a famous artist, a cult figure in Europe, toiling as a drawing teacher at a children's colony. Word of his success was spreading, and like any sensible person, he considered returning to Paris. So, Chagall applied for an exit visa, and while waiting for approval, he wrote his autobiography, My Life, which is the basis for the story of this amazing artist I'm telling you. At the end of the book he writes, "Neither Tsarist nor Soviet Russia needs me. I'm not understood. I'm a stranger here. I'll take my wife and daughter with me. I'm coming to you, Peteta. I'm coming to you for good. And perhaps following Europe's lead. Did my Russia will love me too." Lunacharsky helped him with a foreign passport and exit permit, and Chagall left Russia with his family, only to return once more. Already a living legend. On his way to France, he first stopped in Berlin to track down the paintings he had left there 8 years earlier, but every single one of them had been sold, and the money from the sales had depreciated so much after World War I, in which Germany was defeated, that he could barely buy a pair of shoes with it. That's how Chagall lost all his early works. On the other hand, it was here that he fully realized how popular and recognized he had become, to the point where he was even listed as one of the founders of Expressionism alongside Van Gogh. Upon returning to France, Chagall, now a famous artist, though not yet recognized in the world's most demanding city, Paris, quickly established a business relationship with the French art dealer Ambroise Vollard, who had worked with masters like Cézanne, Renoir, Picasso, Gauguin, and Van Gogh. And he painted a lot, drawing on his memories of Vitebsk, staying true to himself now that no one was demanding otherwise. In 1926, he had his first exhibition in the United States at the Reinhardt Gallery in New York, which featured about 100 of his works, though he wasn't present. It wasn't until 1927 that Chagall became famous in the French art world, when the art critic and historian Maurice Reynaud included him in his book Modern French Painters. Returning to Paris from one of his trips, Vollard commissioned Chagall to illustrate the Old Testament. Although he could have finished the project in France, he used the assignment as an excuse to go to Israel, where he spent 3 whole months enjoying speaking with people in Hitler's. Upon returning to France, he began a series of etchings for the Bible, but by the start of World War II, he had only finished 66 out of 105. He wouldn't complete them until 1956, after returning from the US. It was written of him. The illustrations were stunning and widely acclaimed. Chagall once again proved himself to be one of the most important graphic artists of the 20th century. World War II World War II began, and the Nazis captured France so quickly that the 54-year-old Chagall, absorbed in his art, found himself trapped along with his wife and daughter. And when the persecution of Jews began again, and the collaborator French government started seeking out naturalized French citizens of Jewish descent to send to concentration camps, it was already too late. The US, meanwhile, required a bond from migrants upon entry to ensure they wouldn't become, after a financial burden, and tickets across the Atlantic cost a fortune. But then Varian Fry, an American journalist, and Hiram Bingham IV, the US vice consul in Marseille, organized an operation to evacuate artists and intellectuals from Europe to the US, providing them with forged visas. Chagall was already on the list of such intellectuals and was just waiting for that precious visa. But in April 1941, Chagall and his wife were stripped of their French citizenship. While waiting, the Chagall stayed at the Hotel Modern in Marseille, where they were arrested along with other Jews. Varian Fry successfully managed to exert enough pressure on the French police to force them into releasing the artists by threatening to expose them in a major public scandal. Marc Chagall was just one of more than 2,000 individuals who were ultimately saved during the course of this daring rescue operation. He finally departed from France in May of 1941, at a time when it was already becoming almost too late to escape. Then, on June 10, 1941, Chagall and his wife, Bella, finally departed from Lisbon aboard the Portuguese passenger ship known as the Muzinho. Among the passengers were 119 refugee children, to whom Chagall gave drawing lessons during the voyage. Что Nitafashi found that his fame had crossed the sea. He'd won a prize for the betrothed 2 years prior. That is Henri Matisse's son Pierre became and became his US agent, staging a hit Chicago show. Critics called him a true gypsy. These paintings do more for his reputation than anything we've seen before. His colors sparkle with poetry. His works are authentically Russian, like a Volga boatman's song. He was offered the chance to design the sets for a ballet based on Pushkin's poem The Gypsies. While in Mexico, Chagall discovered that the local folklore resonated deeply with his own. Feeling inspired, he designed the colors for the stage sets by using traditional national patterns. He painted 4 elaborate backdrops while the local seamstresses worked to sew all of the costumes. The ballet was a huge success. Chagall took 19 encores, soon reaching New York's Metropolitan Opera. It was a repeat success. The critics called it a dramatized exhibit of giant paintings. It truly surpasses absolutely everything Chagall has ever created on an easel. It is the kind of breathtaking, magnificent spectacle you would hardly expect to find in a theater. Now, then, in 1944, Bela died from a streptococcal infection. She couldn't get penicillin, which was in short supply because of the war. Her death left Chagall stunned for a long while. He stopped painting, but when he returned to art, he dedicated it to his beloved wife's memory. Soon, he was exhibited at New York's MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, perhaps the most prestigious modern art museum in the world. But a year later, the war ended, and in the fall of 1956, the 59-year-old Chagall hurried back to his adopted home of Paris, arriving for the opening of his solo exhibition at the National Museum of Modern Art, the Pompidou. Solo exhibitions at the Pompidou and MoMA are the pinnacle of what a modern artist can achieve. There was a grand prize. In 1910, Chagall was commissioned to paint a Paris opera ceiling. It sparked debate. Many disliked a Russian Jew, a modern artist, painting a French treasure. It took the 77-year-old a year, and the premiere was packed. The audience saw a ceiling divided into 5 color segments, paying tribute to composers Mozart, Wagner, Mussorgsky, Berlioz, and Ravel, as well as famous actors and dancers. After the unveiling, even the harshest critics of the commission seemed to fall silent. The press unanimously declared Chagall's new work a great contribution to French culture. After that, he created many more works that became his priceless legacy. Stained glass windows for the synagogue at the Hadassah Medical Center of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a stained glass window titled Peace for the UN building, a stained glass window at Union Church in New York State. Two monumental murals hanging on either side of the new Metropolitan Opera building at Lincoln Center in New York, and many, many others around the world from Switzerland to Israel. Chagall's final work was a tapestry for the Chicago Rehab Institute. The study for the piece, titled Job was finished, but Chagall died shortly before the tapestry was completed in 1985 at the age of 98, and it was finished without him. 13 years before his death, in 1972, Chagall returned to Russia for 2 weeks at the invitation of the USSR Ministry of Culture for a solo exhibition organized in Moscow. He visited the Tretyakov Gallery and saw his paintings on the walls of the legendary museum, but he refused to go to Vitebsk. Jewish Vitebsk had been completely destroyed by the Nazis, and all the Jews had been rounded up into concentration camps. Of the 260,000 people living in the city at the time, only 118 survived. The city that had lived in Chagall's soul for nearly 100 years no longer existed. Khrushchev-era apartment blocks had replaced the wooden houses, and Chagall didn't want to destroy the naive childhood and even mystical memories that had inspired him throughout his long life. The Vitebsk are left to remain in my memory. In the art world, there's a constant debate over whether Chagall is a Russian artist. Chagall's book, My Stories Basis, was translated by Bella from Yiddish to French and published in 1913 Testano, così mete costa 10 taz, detikets pestamota zimatik tazit Petersburg. The Russian version from the French only appeared in 1990, after his death. Soon, what Chagall achieved as a Russian Jew happened in spite of, rather than because of, Russia. France gave him what he wanted most, the freedom to create, and I think it's more honest to call him a French artist of Russian origin. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's talk. An incredible story, right? But friends, I have one request. I run this channel alone, and every video is a massive undertaking, which is why they come out so rarely. But together, we're building the best art channel on the Russian-speaking internet, no doubt about it. And I could really use your support. Please subscribe, even for the smallest donations here on YouTube, or on Boosty, or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description, and thanks for watching. Bye everyone!